In order to generate real business, real growth, acquire new customers, you need real people telling their stories, sharing their passion and expertise. And so it's why I actually believe the future of marketing is all in employee, what I call activation, or it's an extension of employee engagement. It's getting those passionate expert employees to share what they know because it works. It doesn't cost as much. Like I said, you've got an existing asset that you're using, your most important one, your employees, to try to acquire, new customers. And so that's really why I think it's so important. It's more effective, it's obviously authentic, it doesn't cost as much, and it'll drive the bottom line more than any other thing a marketer could do.
Hi, Michael. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for joining me here today. So, Michael is the CEO and founder of Marketing Insider Group. And I'm actually very excited to have you here today as part of this internal marketing conversation because we wanted to take a look at your particular views on how we can utilize and leverage our employees as part of our content marketing strategy. But before we do that, could you just share with us who is Marketing Insider Group? What do you guys do exactly?
Yeah. So thank you for having me, first of all. And after I'm excited to talk about internal marketing, I think it's really neat and cool that you have this perspective and focus. It's so important. So I actually started my career in sales briefly and then moved into marketing for 25 years, companies large and small, and started getting asked by friends of mine in the industry, can you come help us as a consultant to build out a content marketing platform? And a lot of the focus was on the internal politics. And when we started Marketing Insider Group in June of 2015, it was a little bit of a combination of keynotes and inspiration. I get asked to come and talk to marketing teams, workshops where we try to get marketing teams on the same page. Now, a lot of our focus is really on delivering content that helps to a brand to rank for search terms, which is a nice measurable thing for us. But the main message, and it's, I think, part of what led you to me, is in order for companies to scale their marketing, they need the support from internal employees. So I can't wait to talk about that.
And that's one of the reasons why I think this kind of podcast discussion is important. And so I just want to jump right into it because you wrote an awesome piece about how companies and marketers can consider using employees as part of their content marketing strategy. So typically when we talk about content marketing, it's in the marketing department. Either we use internal copywriters within marketing or we outsource, whatever the case may be, and we're just generating content that's providing value. But you came from the perspective of recognizing, hey, even outside of the marketing function, which is more formal, we have a bevy of employees who can not only act as content developers, but some of them are influencers in their own networks. They can be advocates. What inspired you to come up with that kind of thinking to share what you shared in the piece?
Yeah, I think part of it was one of the favorite quotes that I have in marketing or about marketing is David Packard, founder of Hewlett Packard, who said marketing is too important to be left to the marketing department. And I've always believed that. And part of it came out of need, out of necessity. The first CMO job that I had no budget, and the only kind of content that we could create that we could use to try to generate any kind of interest or awareness was essentially expertise, FAQs, answers to questions, survey results from our existing employees and customers. And so it for me came out of, how do you do marketing when you don't have a budget? You got to rely on the colleagues around you who know and care and have passion for all the things that you do. So part of it started there. The other thing that happened in my career, the very first business book that I read voluntarily in my first job was a book called The Service Profit Chain, which was it was an article in the Harvard Business Review back when I first started working too many years ago. And the same group of guys that wrote this article published a book about what they talked about in the article. The gist of it was that the most successful companies have highly engaged employees because those highly engaged employees are happy to make their customers happy, and those customers spend more and stay longer, and therefore the company. So it's this, total virtuous cycle of, if you have engaged employees, they're the ones that are going to create value, spread the word, share the joy of what your company does with the customers, who are then going to tell their friends, and so on, as we used to say. And so those are some of the inspirations that I saw, both the necessity, the great quote from Dave Packard, and just that first book, that kind of all made it come together for me pretty early on in my career, that employees are such a great asset to companies. and they're probably the best asset that we can use to try to acquire new customers.
Absolutely. And I don't think there's anyone who would disagree with that. So even if, again, you're looking at, okay, how can I use my employees as a critical part of my content marketing strategy? The employees first have to be even engaged before that can happen. So my question is, how do I know? I mean, what are some of the ways that I can gauge that level of employee engagement before I even start to bring anybody in to be a part of the content marketing discussion?
Yeah, there's some great benchmarks. Gallup has been doing a study for years on employee engagement. When I worked at the Nielsen company, we actually worked with Gallup to benchmark us against our peers. The latest stats are 32% of employees on average are unhappy with the jobs that they're in. 17% are what they call actively disengaged. And I always make the joke, what does that mean? I think it means that they're stealing pencils and pens and they're breaking their computer on purpose and they're calling in sick when they're not. They're sabotaging the company. It's a horrible number. The easy answer is you can ask Gallup to come in and do a survey. You could just do it your own. Go get SurveyMonkey and ask a couple of questions. In my book, Mean People Suck, I talk about a couple of simple questions that you could ask, just two or three that you could ask your employee base on a consistent basis. And then I also recommend you ask your customers a similar question. Are you engaged in your work? Do you see innovation happening? Would you recommend us as one of the net promoter scores is one of the more popular ones for customers? I would love to see that applied inside companies where we say, would you recommend your manager to other employees? That's how you're going to know if your employees are engaged. And so, again, you can use Gallup, you can look at their benchmarks, you can just expect that your organization out there has a third of its employees that aren't really happy, 17% are probably really unhappy, and you can conduct your own surveys as well.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting when you're talking about employee engagement and surveys because I think in a lot of companies there is a bit of a gray area about whether or not there should be one center of excellence as far as who owns employee engagement or who owns this whole thing of employee insights and making sure that we have our fingers on the pulse of it. But in your view, who really should be owning employee engagement in that respect and employee insights in a company?
Yeah, it's getting into organizational design is always a little bit of a tricky thing. Again, in the book, I talk about how we need to break the current org structures, the org chart in most companies. No company puts the customer at the center of their organization because if they did, they would organize very differently. I talk a lot about one example, a company called Marketo, which is now owned by Adobe. And a former colleague of mine from SAP went to run the company, Steve Lucas, and he actually took a marketing person and put her with a direct line to the head of HR. And so it was a partnership, if you will. It was a marketer by training, but put her into the HR organization to drive an employee engagement program. And it's one of the most successful programs I've ever seen. They saw 100% participation in the program. They saw massive amounts of new internal recruiting that was happening. They saw content storytelling that they were generating getting shared 30% more. They saw higher click through rates. I think 74% higher click through rates from employee generated content than from brand generated content. And I talk about it in the book. It's just a great case study. Her name was Kristen. Should Kristen have worked and stayed in the marketing department? I'm not really sure. I think Steve made the decision because he wanted the marketing mindset to be seeded into the HR organization for whatever reason. So it's a tricky question, but I like the way, if you think about bringing the marketing skills and trying to proliferate that inside an HR strategy, I think that's, however or where it sits, I think that's what has to happen.
You raised a point which actually was a great segue into my next question because I wanted to find out why should marketers even start to think of employees as a great source of content?
Yeah, I think it's, again, the number it's a stat from LinkedIn that showed that content created by employees is three times more likely to be engaged with than if it's created or shared by the brand. And the crazy number is it's 10x if it's compared to an ad. And if you think about it, what choices do marketers have to communicate in today's world? Well, you can buy an ad. Anybody can do that. It costs money and has questionable value. You can create content, which is what we help companies do. We try to do it at low cost with high scale and measurable to organic search. But in order to generate real business, real growth, acquire new customers, you need real people telling their stories, sharing their passion and expertise. And so it's why I actually believe the future of marketing is all in employee, what I call activation, or it's an extension of employee engagement. It's getting those passionate expert employees to share what they know because it works. It doesn't cost as much. Like I said, you've got an existing asset that you're using, your most important one, your employees, to try to acquire, new customers, which is the thing that Wall Street and the board is looking at, is the bottom line revenue numbers. And so that's really why I think it's so important. It's more effective. It's obviously authentic. It doesn't cost as much, and it'll drive the bottom line more than any other thing a marketer could do.
And I love the fact that you mentioned authenticity, because especially we're living in unprecedented times with this pandemic. There's a deep need for brands to be far more authentic in how they're engaging their customers. And what better way to do it than with the real people who represent the organization? Do you think the model should be any different for B2B company or B2C?
Sure. Yeah, I see the same mistakes. So in B2B, you've got an executive said the company creates a press release. Company A acquires company B. You generate a press release, executive share it out. Please share with your networks this latest press release. And who gets excited about sharing a press release from their company? No one at all. And so in the consumer world, I think it's a little bit different. I don't think they ask their employees to share press releases. They go out and hire Kylie Jenner to talk about it for $1 million. And I think both of those approaches miss the point of authenticity, right? They're not tapping into employee self-interest. They're not tapping into consumer self-interest on the consumer side. So I do think employee generated content is more important on the B2B. Consumer generated content is more important in the consumer space. But the stories you want those people, those two different groups to tell, should be the stories they want to tell, not a forced upon them endorsement paid for by the company or pushed by, with this sort of unspoken, if you don't do this, the boss will be unhappy in B2B. But yeah, that's one of I always tell clients, don't ask anyone to share or create something. Ask people who wants to share and create stuff, and then build amazing platforms for those employees. And then the next question is always, why would we do that? They're just doing that because they want a better job or make more money. They're adding value for you if you do that. And so you're helping them help you. And so it's a very simple concept. It's more natural and authentic, and it tends to work, which is something we can't forget in these challenging times.
Do you have any perhaps examples that you could share, maybe from your experience, of companies that are doing this very, very well?
Yeah, so I talked about Marketo. Unfortunately, Steve left. Kristen Kane, who was the leader of that organization and program, left. She's actually a local resident nearby, and she now runs an employee activation. She runs strategy for an employee activation company. The story that I do love to tell, though, is Capgemini. And I advised them on some content strategy in my early days of starting my agency, but I can't take credit. This was really, there's a woman named Reena Patel who was really a relatively junior brand manager for Capgemini. And Capgemini is a professional service company. Their CEO looked around at their competition, KPMG, Deloitte, Accenture, these big companies, and he saw that they love to sponsor golf. They like to sponsor golfers and golf tournaments, and Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson. And so the CEO wanted them to do the same thing. And Rena really pushed back all the way up to the CEO. And basically she said, listen, we've got these amazing experts inside our company that for really no money or very little money can share what they know out on the platforms and the connections that they have. And so for 0.1%, and literally she said, for 0.1% of the cost of a golf sponsorship, I think I can generate 10, 100 times the outcomes. And so they built a platform. It was called Content Loop. They called it Content Loop because it was employee generated content shared on their website, but pushed out essentially by LinkedIn and by employees on LinkedIn with a connection request that said, hey, if you like this article, connect with the author, Joe Smith. And what they found after the course of doing 1 year of really saving on a $20 million golf sponsorship budget, they saw huge website traffic and they saw revenue. They saw leads come in. And so they doubled down in the second year. And the way I heard this story is crazy as well. I kept in touch with Rena, but I was presenting just that first half of the story to another group. And this guy walks up to me and he said, I was at Capgemini after Rena left. And the second year, we generated $24 million in revenue on $100,000 platform budget. It was just budget to maintain the platform where the content was published. $24 million in actual sales revenue because they had a small group of employees who wanted to create content. They pushed them, they published them and promoted them on their corporate website, had the employees share it naturally and authentically on LinkedIn with a connection request to say, hey, if you like this, connect with me. It generated leads and generated revenue. And so content loop doesn't exist anymore. It's now just the Capgemini website. If you go to their website, you're going to see employee stories all over the place because they now have basically built this model into their entire digital strategy. And it's all reliant upon employees finding new customers and generating revenue.
I think that example is a great segue into my next question, because is there a difference between the brand deciding, okay, we're going to use employees as content developers versus leveraging employees as influencers in their own network? Is there a difference? I'm sure there probably is, but what does it look like?
Yeah, I personally don't really like the term influencers because it feels like you're trying to take somebody who's famous and get them to do something they wouldn't normally do. And that's why I like the term employee activation better, because you're taking people that already have a passion and a personality and you're just asking if you can amplify it. And like I said, I think the biggest mistake is for trying to force it. But what's the opposite of that? The opposite of that is helping employees build their personal brands, helping the employees that want to build their personal brands. There's a lot of research done. It was it was done by a guy named Jakob Nielsen back in the late 1990s, and it's been updated multiple times since. It's called the law of unequal distribution. And I don't know if you've heard of it, but basically it says that if you look at the web, a very small percentage of people create most of the content that gets any engagement. But then there's a slightly larger percentage of people they don't create, but they share it. And then there's a massive amount of people, 90%, in fact, of most audiences. All we do is consume. We're just sponging on the brains of other people. So, my objective with companies is number one, find that 1% that want to create. Once you've done that, then find the next 9% or so of your employees that are actively looking to share. They want to build their personal brands. They want to have a voice. They want to participate in the conversations online with their networks. Give them the tools and the content they need. But again, don't force it. It's only because they naturally want to that you're giving them a platform. The 90%, let them be. Let them be consumers. Let them be good employees. Hopefully, you've got engagement programs for them. Kristen at Marketo, one of her tricks was share a new picture of your baby or a puppy you've adopted. Or there are ways to get people that wouldn't normally create content to share on a human level. And that was one of her tricks. But again, the law of unequal distribution shows that a very small percentage of people will create, a slightly larger percentage, but still minority of people will share. Encourage them as much as you can. Create platforms and strategies and programs that reward and recognize and encourage those kind of behavior.
Are you more of an advocate of folks having employees be the ones to generate that on their own, or would you recommend a little bit more structure and control?
It's such a good question. The way it was asked to me by a marketer about 2 years ago, it was a company I was presenting to their annual marketing team. It was about 100 people in Chicago. And they asked me this question about editorial standards and guidelines, and that they struggled with getting their employees to maintain some of those editorial structures and guidelines and tones and voice. And I told them, I said, I think the only answer is to lessen the amount of control. And the faces, I could tell they were shocked and horrified at the thought of really letting employees do whatever they want. But my point is, like with any control system, you tune a dial, the more you tune up the control, the less stuff you're going to get. And it's really that simple. I have a very different view than, let's say, the brand police do at certain companies. My whole thought when I was at SAP, I used to tell people, and I ran a platform that was really successful all on the backs of volunteer contributors. And my whole thing was, I don't care if you love cats and you want to write about how much you love cats, we'll give you a platform to do that. And no one ever did, by the way. But my point was, because somebody out there is a potential employee, customer, investor of our company that is going to love the fact that there's somebody here who's willing and has been encouraged and allowed to share their love of cats. Again, my point was our editorial standards were relatively low. We essentially said, share what you're passionate about, share something, answer a real question that exists in the world. Don't talk about products. Don't do what your boss wants you to do. Share something from the heart and from your expertise. And we saw tremendous success. So that's, again, I realize there's two ends of the spectrum. There's the brand people that need to maintain some control. I'm more of a naturalist, if you will. I just believe that if you let people do, if you encourage them to share what they know and what they love, more of them will do so. It will be more authentic and it will work better. And I've seen that work.
Well, that's the benefit of having these great ideas being shared, because I think there is a fit for everybody. And is there kind of a middle of the road? Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I think the middle of the road is, I just had this conversation with a client. The middle of the road is like, hey, we're not going to talk about politics, controversial topics. We're not going to wade into some of the crises and tensions that are happening around the world. I personally feel it's a little bit of a cop out. I want to work with a brand that knows what it believes in, that stands up for equality and the things that we know are all right in the world. I think that is the middle ground. The middle ground is to say, we'll let our employees have some freedom, but within certain guidelines. We're not going to let them stray into certain things that might get us into trouble. That's, I think, the middle road. But again, what we're seeing is we're seeing audiences, consumers revolt against that sort of generic lack of courage kind of approaches. So again, it's why I'm on one side of the spectrum. I don't believe in too much structure and too much of a guy, too many guidelines. I used to say, when I worked with a company whose lawyers didn't want employees blogging. And I remember them, because they kept saying we're liable. And I was like, no, because it's not the brand talking. I was at SAP. It's not SAP writing an article. It's Michael Brenner writing an article. And it's my point of view. It's me sharing. We weren't even doing controversial topics. It was just, hey, what is business intelligence and how can it help your business? Like the liability issues were zero. And once I explained it to the lawyers, it's not the brand talking, then why should the brand really have any say in the tone and the voice and the structure and the guidelines? So again, that's my perspective. I understand there's another side of the argument.
I wanted to kind of do a quick temperature check with you, because I had another conversation on another episode about the role of the internal comms team versus marketing. Because the next question is going back to what you wrote. You mentioned using the same approach, engaging employees as part of a content strategy for internal communications, also as a way to drive engagement. How do you see, if you see a difference between the role that internal comms plays versus what marketing plays?
Yeah, I do think there are some differences. Obviously, the channels are different. Instead of an external public platform, you're talking about for employees only, essentially. But I do think that the two should be connected. And the reason is that the employee engagement, the reason you do internal communications is to make sure your employees know what's your strategy, what's the latest news, what's driving the business, what's important to the business or the industry you're in. Many of those things are important to your external audiences as well. And so when we develop content strategies for our clients, we just look at internal comms as one of the channels of distribution for the content that we're creating. We look at employees as one of the audiences that we want to create content for. In fact, maybe the most important audience, again, because employees are the ones, if we think of them as a marketing channel, are the ones that we can help to guide the message that they share with people externally. What are the outcomes? The outcomes could be different. Again, for an employee engagement or an internal communications platform, you want to make sure that you're maybe measuring the employee engagement that's due to the success of those programs. Are you getting referrals? Are people talking about that you're a great place to work? Are you building in customer acquisition? The best sales force every company has is the employees that aren't in sales. And that's what we're talking about. So are there ways that you can measure those kind of connections that might be happening, those kind of conversations that might be happening? So again, yeah, I think internal audiences, employees are a persona, are an audience that should be considered in your content strategy. Internal platforms should certainly be considered as a distribution channel. And I will say too, in fairness to brand people, that is where I do think consistency in tone and voice structure making sure that there are some guiding principles in the way that you say things. I do think it makes a difference there, because you don't want employees confused about what the message really is. And so that's, I think, a way to bring that structure in.
So we started out by talking about how we use employees as part of our content marketing strategy externally. Your recommendation is that a similar approach to be used with internal comms to help drive engagement. What does that look like practically?
One of my favorite mechanisms to use is what I call profiles. And marketers love to create case studies, and buyers and consumers never read case studies. The example, and I don't mean to throw into my former colleagues under a bus, but I worked inside an organization where I had a $100,000 budget, and I generated 1 million page views with that budget because of employee stories. My colleagues and the rest of the team had a $4 million budget, all of which was supposed to be to develop case studies for sales, and their average number of views per video was 1.8. So they had about 2 views. So their $4 million in total generated less than a tenth of the traffic that I generated with $100,000. That's one of my favorite ways to show how, when you just let things go a little bit, it can really work. So one of the ways that we did that is we used customer profiles instead of case studies. I would take somebody like you and put you in front of the camera and say, tell me about you. What are the challenges that you're facing? How are you solving those challenges every day? How is your company surviving and thriving in these crazy times? What do you see as the biggest trends happening in our industry? None of those things would need legal approval from you if you wanted to talk about your company. Getting a case study from a company, you need a legal approval. We do the same thing with employees. I love to do that with customers, partners, and employees. So one of the best ways to do, I think, internal comms is to take an interview-based approach. Think like a publisher, think like a news organization. And if it's an executive strategy, go talk to the CEO. What is this strategy all about? Why do we need this strategy? How are we going to implement it? What are the measures that we're going to use to show success? Make it like an interview, so it's not like some sort of overly polished and PR'd. Turn it into a short 30-second video. So doing those things both at the senior level when it comes to strategy, as well as at the lowest level when it comes to rewarding the kind of behaviors that we want to encourage, it can work from top to bottom.
Michael, we've been having such a great discussion. I think there are lots of nuggets that we can come away with today. Is there any sort of a key takeaway? Because I'm sure we've been impacting some folks who have been listening and saying, hey, I think there's some value in this. My budget has been cut. Kidding. But yeah, there's some value in this discussion. I really need to be engaging and looking at engaging more of my employees in my content marketing. What would you say is the biggest takeaway that you'd love our listeners to come away with today?
Yeah, we didn't really get into this at all, I keep thinking I may write a book about it, but so many good books have been written about the word, and it's a buzzword these days, but it's storytelling. And what I would say is that stories evolved from the dawn of humankind to teach us the most important things that we needed to know: where we should live, what we should eat, what berries to avoid. Like, all of those things came down to us in the form of stories. And what we're seeing now in these crazy times with budgets being cut is that the brands that are breaking through, whether it's with marketing or with hiring or with just goodwill overall, is the decent people that are telling real stories that tap into our emotion. And so that would be my sort of takeaway for everybody, is if you take that approach, and you think of the number one job of marketers, the number one job of a brand overall, is to engage in storytelling so that you can acquire great customers, so that you can attract the best talent in your industry from an employee perspective. And the best way to do that is just tell the stories of the people that are your existing employees and your existing customers.
I love that. I love that. Because it's the people. It's the people that are behind the brand. And I think that consumers especially love to connect with the people component of a brand as opposed to just a nameless, faceless logo of colors. Michael, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. And I always like to ask my guests when we wrap up, how can our internal marketing tribe support you?
Oh gosh, just reach out to me on LinkedIn and connect, I think, is really the best thing you can do. If you're really into content marketing, come to marketinginsidergroup.com. I try to publish 2 or 3 really practical stories each week. Come and check it out. Subscribe there if you're interested, but just a simple say hello on LinkedIn and connect with me. And if there's anything I can do to help, please let me know.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. We appreciate your time, your insights. It's been an awesome conversation, and we just want to wish you and yours all the best and continue to stay safe.
Same to you. Thanks for having me.
So join us next time when we'll continue to flip the marketing conversation right here on the Internal Marketing Podcast. The Internal Marketing Podcast is available on your favorite podcasting app.